Here's a typical page of Durier's edition of the Heroides, which some people might regard as being too informative. On every page, he gives a list of all the manuscripts which record those particular lines. And look at the note on line 102, where he lists the individual manuscripts which contain the reading et, even though he doesn't believe that that's the correct reading. Some people might say that an apparatus like this is too generous and distracts attention from the text itself. Here's that passage from Memories 1-2 as given in my own edition. Now, I, of course, am prejudiced in favour of this sort of reporting in the apparatus, where only the most significant manuscripts are reported individually and the less significant are generally reported just as a group. Now, suffice it to say that this is the method by which most editors present an apparatus. In making collations, an important point to decide is what exactly to look for when reading a manuscript. To take a specific instance, why had no one thought to collate line 1-21? The reason's quite simple. Very often texts were based on far too few manuscripts. Since the Hamilton manuscript was unknown, editors had been influenced predominantly by the three oldest known manuscripts, R, P, and S. And as it happened, R was damaged at that line and couldn't be read. P had been torn across centuries before and doesn't start until 30 lines later in that poem. And that left only S, which, although it's an early manuscript, has very little individual worth. In fact, I found only one certainly correct reading in the whole of the Amores that's reported exclusively by S. So, age doesn't necessarily confer importance. Since S has veniam pacemque, and it seemed to make sense, editors were happy with that. Now, this raises the question, what do you actually choose to collate when reading manuscripts? Now, this is far too complex a subject to go into in any detail now, so perhaps I could just mention one incident in my career as a manuscript collator. It was the high point in all the drudgery involved in reading through the manuscripts, and it involves a reading which can't possibly be correct. At Amores 2.10.9, in my edition, as in the Oxford text, I print the conjecture ero velut instead of any of the readings reported by the manuscripts. Without going into any argument as to why this reading's correct, here is my collation book. As you can see, ero velut isn't in any manuscript, and if you look at the next slide, here's a reading in a 15th century manuscript which has erat ut. Since that doesn't scan, it can't possibly be correct. Well, one afternoon in Oxford, I was supposed to be playing in a cricket match, but it was cancelled because of rain, so I went to the Bodleian Library and asked for a manuscript which I'd never seen before and which hadn't been collated by any previous editor. I chose it more or less at random. When I got to this line, I saw that the manuscript contained none of the usual variants, erant ut, or erat ut, or erat et ut, or erat ut a, or erat ut in. What the manuscript had was ergo velut, which means therefore just as, and that makes no sense at all, for we need a verb here. But the fact that it made no sense was very strong evidence in support of the emendation ero, for how would ergo have gotten into the manuscript if not by a miscopying of ero? Now, needless to say, I was absolutely delighted to find this impossible reading. Even though ergo stood as plain as could be in the manuscript, I felt I had to share it with someone right then and there. And the Bodleian is one of the few places where you can find expert paleographers just sitting about. So I asked a rather distinguished looking elderly lady whom I didn't know if she would mind just looking at it for me to confirm what I was seeing. Well, of course she confirmed it, but she gave me a strange look for even asking. Now, I learned a great deal about Ovid's poetry while preparing the edition, but there are certainly things I would do differently now. One is that I'd rely less on photographs and microfilms and try as much as possible to collate manuscripts in situ by visiting the various libraries. For it stands to reason that it's possible to see things more clearly when looking at the original. I should say, however, that this isn't always the case. A trip to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris was primarily intended to check the text of one particular passage of one particular manuscript. It was an especially problematic passage because it contained quite a number of Greek words, and copyists nearly always have a hard time with Greek. Not only that, but the page in this manuscript was rather the worse for wear because of water damage. But paradoxical as it may seem, the autopsy of the manuscript was no help at all. The details of the writing actually showed up better on the photograph. The other thing I would do differently is that I would pay far more attention to marginal comments in the manuscripts. Now, any editor of any text naturally consults all previous editions, but it's not the case that comments written in the margins of manuscripts are always looked at. But this needs thinking about. There's no reason to suppose that scholarship suddenly began with the invention of printing. Why should there not be precious material to be mined from the margins of the manuscripts? There seem to be two main reasons why editors, myself included, tend rather to ignore marginalia. One is that they're nearly always far harder to decipher than the actual text, and this circumstance is not helped by the fact that it seems pretty clear that in making copies of manuscripts, libraries sometimes aren't quite as careful with the material surrounding the actual text. The other reason is that scholars tend to have a prejudice against and disdain for the value of comments in the margin. For example, look at the rather nice manuscript of Catullus, it's in Oxford, where the first marginal comment at the start of poem 64 assures us that narrat hic historiam aurii veleris. Here Catullus is telling the story of the Golden Fleece, which doesn't tell us anything we didn't know already. And what about the heading on the Edinburgh manuscript of the Amores? A later hand solemnly assures us that what we are about to read is Ovidius de Sine Titulo, Ovid's poem about without a title. What happened, of course, is that the title dropped out, then a scribe noted that the work was Sine Titulo, and then along came another scribe to copy that manuscript, and he recorded that De Sine Titulo was the actual title. Now, that's admittedly a rather egregious and amusing comment. But to return to that other page from that same manuscript, one that we've looked at earlier, I have to admit that I took no account of the marginalia, which for all I know would have told me a lot that would have enhanced my commentary. At the very least, I shouldn't have ignored them. Obviously, there's much more that could be said, but I hope that I've been able to give you some idea of what editing a text actually involves. There's a tendency to suppose that textual critics are a breed apart and that textual criticism is some sort of arcane mystery. Well, that's not true, but it's not a new prejudice. It's been around at least since the early days of the library at Alexandria. One of the most splendid words in the Greek language is gonia bombyx, which means someone who sits in the corner and gibbers to himself. It was coined to describe scholars in the library who fretted over the precise form and meaning of particular Greek words. But it's unfair. Textual critics have a vital role to play in academic progress, and only a minority of them are Gonia bombuces.